There's a lot of talk lately about new U.S. dietary guidelines coming from the FDA. Every few years, the FDA releases these dietary guidelines that tell Americans how we're supposed to eat. Most famous that we've talked about in carnivore circles really are the 1980 guidelines, which really put a heavy emphasis on carbohydrates, with the subsequent explosion in obesity that comes afterwards when you start feeding human beings as if they're cattle. And those guidelines have changed in superficial ways over the years, adjusting up or down the amount of carbohydrates and sugars they tell Americans to consume. But at the end of the day, it's still a plant-based diet they've been pushing on us for 40 years. And there's a lot of the talk in carnivore social media groups and among some influencers who are actually willing to touch political issues, which frankly not enough people are willing to do that, when politics unfortunately touches everything. And this is not a partisan thing either. This is a across the board, everyone involved really has demonstrated that they don't have our best interests at heart when they are the decision makers responsible for this stuff. And it needs to be talked about. But there's a lot of bad talk about this going on too. Sort of, you see these stories about how more grains are put at the bottom of the food pyramid, more plants and less reliance on red meats, which turns into people saying that frosted flakes are now at the bottom of the food pyramid, which isn't exactly accurate. It's not entirely inaccurate either. It's just a distortion of what's going on. But this does kind of beg a question. Where does all this come from? Well, my background is public policy. That's what my PhD is in public policy, specifically around sustainability. And so we can talk about where this comes from with some good information here. And I like to use sources from people who are on the other side of the issue from us, because oftentimes these advocacy pieces they publish will really tell you what they think about you. And so I'm going to give you an idea where this comes from. And I want to point out to you something. The dietary guidelines in the United States come from lobbying. They admit this. There is open reporting from very mainstream sources that say grains were put at the bottom of the food pyramid, at the base of the old food pyramid, and then as like half of your My Plate later on, under the influence of lobbying. This was industry money that came in. And I just want to sort of do some comparing here for you, because you can see really when they hide the numbers, you can actually see still the gross disparity of things by just the general outcome. Money talks, right? And so let's start here with an organization that is definitely not on the side of animal-based advocates of any kind, whether you're talking Dr. Saladino's animal-based paleo that he promotes, or a classic ketogenic diet, or the carnivore diet, and across the spectrum. These folks here are not on our side, and that's the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And about almost 2 years ago now, they published this funny little article called U.S. Meat and Dairy Companies Spend Millions Lobbying Against the Thermometer Legislation. Now, they talk about here how huge amount of money, because they give you this large number that they hope you'll focus on and not notice the context. And so basically, they give this long article that tells you that various meat industry lobbying groups since the year 2000 spent $200 million lobbying against environmental policies. That sounds like a huge amount of money. Since the year 2000, this article was published in 2021. So if we do just a little bit of math, we find out that the various U.S. meat and dairy organizations, the lobbying groups, spent about $10 million a year. That's not much in lobbying. If you think that's a lot of money, you should go see what oil and the medical industries and others spend lobbying every year, and it dwarfs that by orders of magnitude. The U.S. meat and dairy industry is influential in some places more at the local level than they are at the national level, where the real legislation happens. And this is why you don't see meat and dairy prominently on the food pyramid, and why red meat is getting pushed off of it. It's, at the end of the day, about money. Let's take a look at some harder data. If you go look at this, they talk here in an article from Time magazine. Okay, this came out. This is an article called "Experts Say Lobbying Skewed the U.S. Dietary Guidelines," And that was published in 2016. Okay, this is not a new article. I will be the first to tell you this, but this is one that really talks about how this happened. It's lobbying, it's political influence, and it's money that determines what is healthy. It's not science. It's certainly not science. It's money. That shouldn't surprise anybody, of course. If you're live in the real world, you will see that this is just money, and this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is bipartisan. This is why, there's a perception that the carnivore space is very conservative, and I know why that is. And as someone who will upfront tell you I'm a pretty conservative guy on most things, this is not so cut and dry, because both political parties in the United States and elsewhere fall under this. Okay. And this is why I'm happy to see in the carnivore space, in comment sections, people saying, hey, yeah, that's not me. I'm, more progressive than most of y'all are, and I'm a strict carnivore. Great. Love to see you here. Let's keep it civil. But from this Time article, there's a subsection here called the debate over fat. Quote, this is not the first time experts have raised concerns about the guidelines. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the USDA treated fat as the primary harm in the American diet, says Nestle. Along with its anti-fat stance, a stance researchers say was never grounded in science, the guidelines also encouraged Americans to eat hefty amounts of carbohydrates. The 1995 edition made bread, cereal, and pasta the foundation of its food guide pyramid, and advised people to eat between 6 and 11 servings of grains every day, compared to just 3 to 5 servings of vegetables and 2 to 4 servings of fruit. Fat was to be eaten, quote, sparingly. This advice to eat more carbs and avoid fat is exactly backwards if you want to improve health and lower body weight, says Dr. Robert Lustig, a pediatric endocrinologist at the University of California, San Francisco. He and other nutrition researchers say the popularity of anti-fat, pro-carb guidelines helped fuel a rise in diet-related health problems. Since 1980, when the government issued its first set of dietary guidelines, the number of Americans who are obese or have type 2 diabetes has more than doubled. Roughly half of all American adults now live with one or more chronic preventable diseases, and rates of childhood obesity have reached, quote, epidemic proportions, according to the National Institutes of Health. In a sign of progress, the 2015 guidelines for the first time do not explicitly advise Americans to put a cap on the amount of fat in their diet. The new diet recommends still advising limiting saturated fat to 10% of a person's total calorie intake. Saturated fat's place in a healthy diet remains controversial, with some experts saying the recommendations are out of step with the latest science. Others applaud the saturated fat limit. End quote. How do you think we got to a carb-based place? Well, that's simple. The agriculture organizations, the cereal companies, and the others lobbied for this. They lobbied for this, and they did it on the back of the research from the 1950s and the 1960s that was just horribly misplaced, that led to those 1970s committee hearings in Congress that blamed President Eisenhower's heart attack on his, red meat consumption, when it was probably a sedentary lifestyle and his rather famous tobacco habit that was more to blame for that than anything else. If the only thing about that period in American history, how much money do you think the tobacco industry was probably spending to keep that off the table of conversation? Probably not an insignificant amount of money. It's money that's behind this, folks. Money and, of course, power, but the two always go hand in hand. So remember, there is talk now of new dietary guidelines coming out to tell us how we're supposed to eat. And while Frosted Flakes are not going to be at the bottom of that food pyramid, or whatever way they formulate it this time, it's still going to be a carbohydrate, plant-based diet that they're going to push on us. The newest research, the most cutting-edge research, is admitting that saturated fats are not the problem. That's good news. What that means for these dietary guidelines, I don't know. But at the end of the day, the lobbying by the meat industry and the dairy industry is pennies on the dollar compared to the lobbying done by, big agriculture. And I will tell you right now, I would love to live in a world where there wasn't any of this lobbying going on at all. That's not the world we live in. That is not the political environment we operate in. I'd love to see that change. We're not there yet. I don't know how to get it to change. People have been agitating for decades to change it and have made zero progress on it. So this is the world we operate in. And if you're on an animal-based diet, the meat industry is the one that we should be at least less hostile to. Although, at the end of the day, My solution to this is to get to know your local rancher, buy from your local rancher if you can afford to do so, buy your dairy from a local dairy producer if you can afford to do so. And if you can really afford to do so and you've got the land, raise your own cows. Not everybody can do that. Sounds like a good life goal to me. I'm curious, though, what you think about these new dietary guidelines that are coming out. What do you expect to see in them? Because we're not getting a clear picture, but the whispering we're getting from like the White House's guidelines and their committees they have on this stuff isn't exactly good, especially not when their allies on the international stage are talking about reducing red meat consumption to non-existent and telling us to, be open to eating insects, while over in the European Union they're adding insect additives now to processed foods. What do you expect to see in these guidelines? Let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore, and thanks for tuning in today.